The courtroom is unusually crowded for what seems like a simple trespassing case. Rows of spectators, legal analysts, and journalists whisper among themselves, intrigued by the unusual circumstances surrounding the defendant. Jack Remington sits at the defendant's table, his posture straight, but his eyes revealing years of hardship. His clothes are old but neatly arranged, a quiet defiance against the image of a helpless, homeless man. He doesn't belong here, not in a courtroom, not as a criminal. Across the room, the prosecution's table is occupied by the attorneys of Belmont Development Group. Their crisp suits and confident expressions contrast sharply with Jack's worn-out appearance. To them, this is just another case, a mere inconvenience in their pursuit of development and profit. The prosecutor steps forward and begins presenting the case. The accusation is straightforward. Jack was caught trespassing on private property. Security footage clearly shows him climbing over a fence into an active construction site. When confronted by security, he refused to leave. Eventually, the police were called, and he was arrested on the spot. The facts seem irrefutable. Belmont Development Group legally owns the land. Jack had no right to be there. But then, Jack does something no one expects. With a calm but firm voice, he declares that the land he allegedly trespassed on belongs to him. The room falls into stunned silence. A few gasps escape from the spectators. The judge leans forward slightly, clearly interested but maintaining a professional demeanor. The prosecutor scoffs, as if amused by the claim. If Jack owned the land, there would be a record of it. There is none. The judge, staying impartial, asks Jack to provide proof of ownership. It is a simple request, but Jack knows it won't be easy. With slow, deliberate movements, he reaches into his worn-out bag. He pulls out a crumpled stack of documents that have seen better days. At the top, barely legible from age, are the words "land deed." Jack places the papers on the defendant's table, smoothing them out with his calloused hands. His voice remains steady, as he insists that he bought the land years ago. But time and hardship have not been kind to his records. The document is incomplete. Some pages are missing, and official seals are faded. The prosecutor wastes no time in attacking the credibility of the document. Without an official, verifiable deed, this claim is meaningless. Jack remains unfazed. He knows the truth. He knows what he lost. The judge, however, is bound by the law. Without solid evidence, Jack's claim cannot be validated in court. But something about the situation doesn't sit right. The judge grants Jack time to present concrete proof of ownership. Until then, the case stands. Jack sits back, gripping the table as the reality of the challenge ahead settles in. He has limited time to prove the truth. And if he fails, not only will he lose his last chance at justice, but he may lose far more than just a piece of land. Before the courtroom, before the accusations, before the struggles of homelessness, Jack Remington had a life filled with hard work, dreams, and an unwavering belief in the American dream. Jack was born and raised in a quiet, working-class town in Indiana. It was the kind of town where everyone knew each other, where people greeted their neighbors with a nod and a smile. But beneath its small-town charm, life wasn't always easy. His father worked at a steel mill, enduring back-breaking shifts to provide for the family. His mother took on multiple jobs cleaning houses, working at the local diner, and picking up sewing work whenever she could. They were good, honest people, but no matter how hard they worked, money was always tight. Jack learned from an early age that nothing in life came easy. He helped his father with odd jobs around the house, fixing broken furniture, repairing fences, and even assisting with car repairs. Hard work wasn't just expected, it was a way of life. But Jack wanted more. And now, he had something even more important than proof. At 18, with few opportunities in town, Jack made a decision that would change the course of his life. He enlisted in the military. Life in the service was tough, but Jack embraced the discipline, the structure, and the sense of purpose it gave him. He was deployed multiple times, stationed in places he had only seen on maps before. He faced grueling conditions, long months away from home, and the constant weight of responsibility. But through it all, he held on to the dream that kept him going one day. He would come back and build a life for himself. And so, after years of service, Jack returned home, determined to start anew. With the money he had saved from his military service, he settled back in Indiana and pursued a craft. He had always been passionate about woodworking. He had learned the basics from his father, but now he was determined to turn it into a livelihood. Jack used his savings to open a small woodworking shop on the outskirts of town. At first, it was nothing more than a simple shed with a handful of tools, but with time and effort, it grew. He crafted furniture, repaired antique pieces, and even built custom cabinets for local businesses. Word spread, and soon he had a steady stream of customers. The business wasn't just about making money, it was about creating something with his own hands, something real. With each dollar he earned, he saved, keeping one goal in mind: buying his own land. He didn't just want a house, he wanted a place he could truly call his own, where he could build a workshop, plant trees, and create a future. After years of saving, Jack finally found a modest plot of land just outside of town. It wasn't much, just a few acres of untouched wilderness. But to Jack, it was everything. He could already picture it in his mind. A small but sturdy house, a spacious woodworking shop, a porch where he could drink coffee in the mornings. It was his dream taking shape. But dreams, no matter how well built, can be shattered in an instant. The 2008 financial crisis swept through the country like a hurricane, destroying businesses, families, and lives. Jack's small woodworking shop, which had once been thriving, was now struggling to survive. Customers vanished, unable to afford custom furniture when they were barely making ends meet themselves. Orders dried up, bills piled up. Jack tried to hold on, pushing himself harder than ever, but no amount of determination could stop the wave that was crashing down. One by one, he lost everything. The shop, the tools, the land he had fought so hard to own. With no income, no assets, and no safety net, Jack found himself on the streets. He was no longer a business owner, no longer a homeowner, no longer a man with a place to call his own. He was just another statistic, another homeless veteran. For years, he drifted from city to city, looking for work, taking whatever odd jobs he could find. Construction sites, warehouses, day labor, anything to get by. But without a stable home, finding consistent work was nearly impossible. Employers didn't trust someone without an address. Jack slept in shelters when he could, under bridges when he couldn't. He learned which streets were safe, which places handed out free meals, and how to stay warm during brutal winters. And yet, through it all, he never forgot about his land. He never stopped thinking about the trees he once walked through, the soil he once called his own. It was that memory that kept him going. And when fate brought him back to that land years later, only to find a construction site where his dream once stood, he couldn't just walk away. Jack knew what he had lost, and now he was ready to fight for it. Jack Remington had spent years drifting from place to place, carrying nothing but the weight of his past. But no matter where he wandered, there was always one thing that lingered in the back of his mind: his land. That patch of earth, those trees, that space he once called his own. He had lost everything, but deep down, he never truly let go. One evening, after another long, exhausting day of searching for work, Jack found himself walking toward the outskirts of his old town. He hadn't planned on coming back, not really. Life had taken him too far from the person he used to be. But something about that night felt different. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was curiosity. Or maybe it was the simple, aching need to see the place where his life had once made sense. As he walked down the familiar roads, memories came rushing back: his old woodworking shop, the diner where he used to grab coffee before work, the quiet streets he once knew so well. But there was something unsettling about it all. It wasn't just the town that had changed. It was him. When he finally reached the land where his dreams had once stood, he stopped in his tracks. The trees were still there, but something was wrong. Bright floodlights illuminated the area. Heavy machinery sat parked behind chain-link fences. And right in the middle of the land he had worked so hard to own a construction site. Jack's stomach dropped. He stepped closer, gripping the cold metal of the fence. The sign attached to it read, "Future site of Belmont Estates, luxury townhomes." Luxury townhomes. On his land. It felt like a punch to the gut. Jack's mind raced. How? How could this have happened? He had worked for years to buy that land. He had signed the papers, had proof that it was his. And yet, there it was being ripped apart, reshaped into something unrecognizable. A deep, burning anger surged through him. He scanned the site, eyes searching for anything that might explain how this was possible. Then, just beyond the construction zone, he saw it. A single oak tree. The same tree he had sat beneath countless times, dreaming of the home he would build. The place he would grow old. His feet moved before he even realized what he was doing. He climbed over the fence, ignoring the sharp edges digging into his hands. His boots hit the dirt with a dull thud. He wasn't thinking about the consequences. He wasn't thinking about anything except that tree. He walked toward it, past stacks of lumber, piles of concrete blocks, and unfinished foundations. The air smelled of sawdust and wet earth, but none of it mattered. When he reached the tree, he ran his fingers along its bark. Memories flooded his mind, sitting beneath it on quiet afternoons, planning his future, the hope, the hard work, the dream that had once been so close. And now? Now, it was gone. Jack sank to the ground, back against the trunk, staring out at what had become of his land. Everything had been taken from him. First, his shop, then his home. And now, even his right to exist on the land he had once owned. He didn't know how long he sat there. Minutes? Hours? Time had lost all meaning. But then, a voice shattered the silence. "Hey, you're not supposed to be here." Jack barely had time to react before the construction site erupted into chaos. Bright flashlights beamed in his direction. The sound of boots on gravel grew louder. Someone was shouting orders. Then came the sharp, unmistakable sound of a police siren. Jack stood, his hands raised slightly, as uniformed officers rushed toward him. One of them barked a command, something about trespassing, about illegal entry. He barely registered the words. Strong hands grabbed his arms, yanking them behind his back. Cold steel cuffs snapped around his wrists. Jack didn't resist. He just stared at the land around him, at what was left of his dream, as the officers led him away. They called him a trespasser, but deep in his heart, he knew the truth. This was his land, and he wasn't going to stop fighting for it. Sitting in the cold, unforgiving courtroom, Jack Remington felt the weight of 100 pairs of eyes pressing down on him. The prosecution had painted him as nothing more than a trespasser, a homeless drifter who had broken into private property. But Jack knew the truth. He had owned that land. He had worked for it, bled for it. And now, standing before the judge, he had one chance to prove it. With a deep breath, he reached into his worn canvas bag and pulled out an old, yellowed document. "This," he said, his voice steady but firm, "is the deed to that land." The courtroom fell silent as Jack placed the paper on the evidence table. The judge motioned for the bailiff to bring it forward. The prosecution leaned in, scrutinizing the document. It was old, creased from years of being folded and unfolded. The ink slightly faded, but the words were still legible. Jack had bought the land fair and square. But then the problem emerged. The judge flipped through the document, scanning it carefully. Then, his expression shifted. "This is an incomplete record," he said, his voice even. It does show an agreement of sale, but there's no final record of the transaction being completed. Jack frowned. What do you mean? The prosecutor seized the opportunity. Your Honor, what Mr. Remington has here is a preliminary contract. Without an official record of the deed transfer, there's no legal proof that he still owns this land. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Jack's hands clenched into fists. He had never imagined this would be a problem. He had paid for that land. He had the papers to prove it. Hadn't he? His memory raced back to that day, the excitement of signing the deal, shaking hands with the seller, walking across the land that was finally his. But paperwork, legal filings, that had never been his strong suit. Maybe he had missed something. Maybe someone had made sure he missed something. The judge looked at him. Do you have anything else to support your claim? Jack hesitated. He needed proof. And if it wasn't in his hands, there was only one other place to find it. That night, Jack sat in the corner of a run-down shelter, staring at the faded contract in his hands. The words blurred together under the dim yellow light. He had been so certain, but certainty wasn't enough. He needed someone who could back him up. Then, a name came to mind. Sam Calloway. Sam had been one of his closest friends back in the day. He had been there when Jack signed the papers, when he made that down payment. If anyone could confirm the sale, it was him. Jack didn't waste time. The next morning, he set out on foot, retracing old streets, hoping that time hadn't erased everything he once knew. When he finally found Sam, it was in a small auto repair shop on the edge of town. The man looked up from under the hood of a rusted pickup, wiping grease off his hands. He was older, heavier, but the moment he saw Jack, his eyes widened in surprise. Jack? Hell, I thought you were. Jack didn't let him finish. Sam, I need your help. Inside the cluttered office of the repair shop, Jack laid out the contract on Sam's desk. You remember this, right? He asked, tapping the paper. You were there when I bought that land. Sam studied it, his brows furrowing. Yeah, he said slowly. I remember. You were so damn proud that day. We even had a couple of beers to celebrate. Jack exhaled. Then I need you to say that in court. Sam hesitated. Jack, I don't know if that's gonna help. Jack's stomach dropped. What do you mean? Sam ran a hand through his graying hair. Listen, man, that land ain't yours no more. The words hit like a sledgehammer. Jack shook his head. No, that's not possible. I never sold it. I never signed it away. Sam sighed. You didn't. But it was taken. Jack felt his pulse spike. Taken? How? Sam opened a desk drawer and pulled out an old newspaper, yellowed and crinkled at the edges. He handed it to Jack and pointed to a small column near the bottom of the page. Property auction. Foreclosed land available for bidding. Jack's breath caught in his throat. Sam's voice was quiet but firm. Your land was seized for unpaid taxes, Jack. It went up for auction. Jack's mind reeled. Unpaid taxes? That didn't make sense. He had always kept up with his payments at least, as long as he had a home to send them to. But when the financial crash hit, when he lost everything, who had been there to tell him? Who had warned him? His voice was barely above a whisper. Who bought it? Sam hesitated. Then he said the name. Belmont Development Group. The room spun. The same company that was now building luxury homes on his land. The same company that had called the cops on him. The same company that had stolen his future. Jack sat back in his chair, gripping the edges of the desk to steady himself. This wasn't just bad luck. This was theft. And now he had something even more important than proof. He had a reason to fight. Jack Remington sat on a splintered wooden bench outside the courthouse, gripping the edges of the newspaper Sam had given him. His land hadn't just been lost. It had been stolen, hidden behind legal loopholes and bureaucratic deception. He needed help. That's when he decided to call Ryan Brooks. Ryan Brooks wasn't the kind of investigator who worked out of fancy offices. He was a former journalist turned independent investigator, known for sniffing out corruption where others looked away. Jack had heard about him years ago, a man who had uncovered real estate fraud schemes, shady corporate dealings, and government bribes. If anyone could dig into Belmont Development Group, it was Ryan. Jack found him in a cluttered office above a second-hand bookstore downtown. Papers were stacked high on every surface. Old case files, newspaper clippings, and coffee-stained notebooks scattered about. Ryan, a man in his early 40s, with tired eyes but a sharp mind, leaned back in his chair as he listened to Jack's story. When Jack finished, Ryan exhaled sharply. Belmont, huh? He rubbed his chin. I've looked into them before. They have a habit of snatching up properties through, let's say, unconventional means. Jack leaned forward. Can you find out what really happened with my land? Ryan gave a small smirk. That's what I do. For the next few days, Ryan scoured through courthouse records, auction documents, and real estate filings. He dug into public records, reached out to old sources, and made discreet calls to city officials. Then, he found something. And it wasn't good. Ryan met Jack at a small diner on the outskirts of town. He placed a manila folder on the table and slid it across. Read it, he said. Jack flipped it open. Inside were photocopies of documents, proof of what Ryan had uncovered. The first thing that stood out was the auction notice. The city is legally required to give a property owner time to reclaim their land before an auction, Ryan explained. Normally, there's a waiting period, a window, where you could have paid back any owed taxes. But look at this. Jack's eyes traced the document. The auction had been scheduled before the legal notification period had expired. They jumped the gun, Ryan continued. It's illegal, but it happens when companies have friends in the right places. Jack's jaw clenched. So they rigged it. Ryan nodded. Not just that. Look at this. He flipped to another page, Jack's official notification letter. Except there was a problem. There's no proof this was ever mailed to you, Ryan said. No return receipt. No tracking. Nothing in the city records shows that you were ever officially warned. Jack's mind raced. That explained everything. He had never received any notices. No letters. No final warnings. Nothing. And now, it was clear why. They never wanted me to know, he muttered. Ryan tapped the table. Exactly. If you had known, you could have challenged it, paid off the back taxes, fought the foreclosure. Instead, they skipped every safeguard. And by the time you realized what had happened, the land was already in Belmont's hands. Jack's fingers tightened around the folder. This wasn't just negligence. This was fraud. And if Belmont Development Group had done this to him, how many others had they done it to? Jack wasn't going to let them get away with it. But he needed someone who could fight them in court. That's when he turned to Victoria Lane. Victoria Lane was a real estate and civil rights attorney with a reputation for going up against corrupt corporations. She was relentless in her pursuit of justice, a woman who had built her career exposing fraudulent property seizures and protecting homeowners from predatory developers. Her office was in a high-rise downtown, stark and professional. Jack sat across from her desk, watching as she flipped through the documents Ryan had gathered. When she finally looked up, her eyes were sharp. "This is bad," she said. Jack swallowed. "How bad?" She leaned back in her chair. "We're not just talking about an illegal foreclosure. We're talking about fraudulent practices, tampered legal documents, and potentially criminal collusion between Belmont and city officials." Jack's stomach twisted. Victoria set the papers down. "Jack, this isn't just a civil case. If we push this hard enough, it could turn into a criminal investigation." Jack met her gaze. "Then, let's push." She studied him for a long moment. "All right," she finally said. "But you need to be ready. Belmont has money, lawyers, and influence. They will fight this with everything they have." Jack exhaled. I don't care. I've already lost everything once. I'm not losing this fight. Victoria nodded, a small, determined smile forming on her lips. Then let's make them regret ever crossing you. Victoria Lane sat in her office, her fingers tracing the edges of the documents spread out before her. Something wasn't adding up. The more she examined Belmont Development Group's acquisition of Jack's land, the more suspicious it became. She had seen shady deals before developers, using loopholes to snatch up properties at bargain prices. But this wasn't just a loophole. This was a full-scale fraud operation. Jack's land wasn't just valuable real estate. It was stolen. And she was about to prove it. Victoria spent days poring over records, making calls, and following a paper trail riddled with inconsistencies. That's when she found it. A forged deed transfer. The document, supposedly transferring Jack's property to the city before the auction, had been altered. The ink didn't match, and the signatures were slightly off, almost perfect, but not quite. She dug deeper and found a payment trail leading to city officials, several suspicious deposits made around the same time. Jack's land went to auction. Bribes. This wasn't just an illegal land grab. Belmont Development Group had paid off government officials to push the deal through. Victoria's heart pounded. If they could prove this in court, Belmont wouldn't just lose the case, they'd be facing criminal charges. She picked up the phone and called Ryan Brooks. Ryan had been working his own angle, digging into Belmont's history. When Victoria told him what she had found, he exhaled sharply. That explains a lot, he said. Why? Victoria asked. Ryan hesitated. Because I just found out why Belmont wanted Jack's land so badly. Victoria frowned. It's just an empty lot, isn't it? Ryan let out a dry laugh. Not even close. Ryan pulled up geological surveys, ones that Belmont had quietly commissioned before they ever bought the land. Jack's property sat on a hidden deposit of rare earth minerals, materials used in high-tech industries, worth millions, maybe more. Belmont had known all along. That's why they had rigged the auction. That's why they had erased Jack from the process. They hadn't just stolen his land, they had stolen his future fortune. Ryan clenched his jaw. They needed him out of the picture before he could find out what he was sitting on. Victoria was silent for a moment. Then she spoke, her voice steady. Then let's put them back in the picture. The day Victoria filed the new evidence in court, Belmont's legal team went ballistic. They knew they were caught. They had spent months, maybe years, covering their tracks, only for a homeless veteran and a handful of relentless truth seekers to unravel it all. But instead of backing down, Belmont did what powerful corporations always did when cornered. They fought back. Within hours of Victoria filing the fraud case, Belmont Development Group turned around and sued Jack for defamation. Their claim that Jack's accusations were false and damaging to their reputation. It was a classic corporate tactic: bury the truth under a mountain of legal battles. If they couldn't erase Jack, they'd break him financially. Victoria knew this wasn't just about money. This was war. And Jack had no intention of losing. Jack Remington knew the fight wouldn't be easy, but he never expected it to turn deadly. The first sign that something was wrong came late one evening. Jack had been staying at a small shelter on the outskirts of town, a place that offered a cot, a warm meal, and a moment of peace. That peace was shattered when he noticed a black SUV parked outside, engine idling, headlights off. At first, he thought it was a coincidence. But then he saw the same SUV the next day, and the next. And then the threat started. A low voice over the phone. Drop the case, or you won't like what happens next. A note slipped under his door. This isn't worth your life. Jack wasn't afraid to fight. But this wasn't a battlefield. This was something else entirely. This was a war where his enemies didn't play by the rules. One night, the shelter went up in flames. Thick smoke billowed into the sky as flames consumed the building. People screamed, rushing outside with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Jack barely made it out in time. Everything he owned, his few belongings, the last remnants of his past life, burned to ashes. The fire department ruled it an accident, but Jack knew better. Someone had sent a message. This wasn't just intimidation. This was a warning, and it had Belmont Development Group's fingerprints all over it. While Jack was left with nothing, Ryan Brooks was piecing together a game-changing discovery. He had been digging through old county records, searching for anything that Belmont didn't want people to see. That's when he found it. An old geological survey from decades ago. It was buried deep in the archives, almost like someone wanted it forgotten. But Ryan knew exactly what it meant. Jack's land wasn't just worth millions. It was worth billions. Jack was still reeling from the fire when Ryan called him. "You need to hear this," Ryan said. Jack listened as Ryan explained what he had found. The minerals beneath his land weren't just valuable, they were some of the rarest on the planet, used in everything from advanced technology to military applications. If Belmont had managed to secure full ownership, they wouldn't just be rich. They'd control one of the most valuable resources in the entire country. Jack gripped the phone tighter. "So that's why they're doing this," he muttered. Ryan exhaled. "They needed you gone before you ever found out." Silence stretched between them. Then Jack said, voice steady, "Well, now I know." The next day, Belmont escalated their attack. Jack was already facing a defamation lawsuit, but now the corporation was taking it even further. They claimed the geological report was a fabrication, accusing Jack of forging documents to inflate the value of his land. It was an absurd claim, but that wasn't the point. Belmont didn't need the truth to be on their side. They just needed to drag Jack through endless legal battles, burying him in so much paperwork and legal fees that he'd have no choice but to give up. Victoria Lane, Jack's lawyer, wasn't fooled. "They're trying to drown you in lawsuits," she told him. "They want to exhaust your resources, make you look like a fraud, and force you into a settlement." Jack shook his head. "I'm not settling." Victoria nodded. "Then we fight." Jack had lost everything before, but this time, he wasn't fighting alone. Jack Remington had fought against impossible odds before. But this was a whole new level of desperation. The courtroom battle had turned into a war of attrition. Belmont Development Group had endless resources, a team of high-powered attorneys, and enough political influence to bury the case forever. Victoria Lane had done everything in her power to keep Jack's case afloat, but without concrete evidence or a credible witness, his chances were slipping away. Then came Lauren Mitchell. She wasn't just any witness. Lauren had worked for Belmont for nearly a decade. She had been inside those boardrooms, sitting across from the executives who orchestrated the land grab. She had seen the forged documents. She had heard the backroom deals. She had watched them destroy lives for profit. And now she was ready to talk. Ryan Brooks, who had been chasing leads nonstop, finally tracked her down. She had left Belmont 2 years ago, disillusioned and disgusted by what she had witnessed. But she hadn't spoken out until now. Jack met her in a quiet diner on the edge of town. Lauren looked exhausted, as if she had been carrying the weight of her knowledge for too long. She didn't sugarcoat it. "They faked the auction," she said, voice low but firm. "The whole thing was a setup. The foreclosure notices? Never sent. The bids? Prearranged." Jack never had a chance. Jack clenched his fists. He had suspected it all along, but now he had confirmation. Lauren hesitated, then added, "And it's not just you. They've done this before." Victoria leaned forward. "How many cases?" Lauren exhaled. "At least a dozen. Maybe more. All swept under the rug." Jack felt his pulse quicken. This wasn't just about him anymore. Lauren agreed to testify. It was the breakthrough they had been waiting for. But just as quickly as hope arrived, it vanished. The night before her scheduled testimony, Lauren disappeared. Her phone disconnected. Her apartment emptied overnight. Her car abandoned near the airport. No notes. No signs of struggle. Just gone. Jack felt the walls closing in. Without Lauren, Belmont's lawyers would rip their case apart. Victoria called every contact she had. Ryan searched through surveillance footage, police reports, flight manifests, anything that could tell them what happened to her. Nothing. Jack sat in Victoria's office, staring at the floor. They got to her. Victoria didn't respond. She didn't need to. The message was clear. Belmont played by their own rules. And they had just erased their biggest threat. The morning of the trial arrived. Jack stood outside the courthouse, watching reporters swarm the entrance. This was supposed to be the day everything changed. Instead, it felt like the day he lost everything. Then, a black sedan pulled up. The door opened. Lauren stepped out. Jack froze. She looked shaken, but determined. Jack rushed over. "Are you okay?" Lauren took a shaky breath. "I had to disappear for a bit. They were watching me." Victoria approached, eyes wide. "Do you still have the documents?" Lauren nodded. "And I have more." Jack exhaled, relief flooding through him. Lauren straightened her shoulders. "Let's take these bastards down." Inside the courtroom, Belmont's attorneys looked confident. They had played this game before. They had crushed opponents before. But they hadn't counted on Lauren walking through those doors. When she took the stand, the room fell silent. And then the truth unraveled. The forged signatures. The illegal payments. The corrupt officials covering it all up. Lauren laid everything bare. Jack watched as Belmont's legal team squirmed, scrambling to discredit her. But it was too late. The walls were closing in on them now. The courtroom was silent. A silence so thick, so heavy, it pressed down on everyone inside. Then, the court finds Belmont Development Group guilty of fraudulent acquisition and unlawful foreclosure. Jack Remington won. The words echoed through the chamber, their weight sinking in as the judge continued. This court hereby orders the immediate return of the contested property to its rightful owner, Jack Remington. Victoria Lane let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Jack, sitting beside her, clenched his fists, barely able to process what had just happened. The gavel struck one final time, sealing Belmont's fate. Jack had his land back. But more than that, the truth was finally exposed. Outside the courthouse, chaos erupted. Reporters flooded the steps, cameras flashing, microphones shoved forward as Jack and his team emerged. "Jack, how does it feel to win? Do you think Belmont's executives will face criminal charges? What's next for you?" Jack paused, taking it all in. The battle he had fought for years had finally come to an end. But he knew this wasn't just his victory. "This isn't about me," Jack said, his voice steady despite the storm of questions. "This is about every person they've done this to. And it's not over." Victoria stepped forward. "We're calling for a full-scale federal investigation into Belmont Development Group. Their corruption runs deeper than this case, and it's time they answer for it." The reporters erupted in more questions, but Jack didn't hear them. He turned, looking beyond the cameras, beyond the crowd, towards something more important. His land. It was still out there, waiting for him. For years, it had been stripped away, turned into a symbol of his defeat. Now, it was something else. A symbol of justice. A symbol of everything he had fought for. Jack Remington had nothing left to prove. He had won. And this time, no one could take it away. The land was his again. But Jack Remington knew it was never just about him. He could have sold it, could have walked away with a hefty sum, and finally left everything behind. But he didn't. Instead, Jack turned his land into something greater. A sanctuary for those who had been forgotten. A community center for veterans and the homeless. A place where people could rebuild just as he had. Sam Calloway, the man who had once watched Jack lose everything, was now at his side, helping bring the vision to life. Ryan Brooks, the relentless investigator, exposed even more corruption within Belmont. His work led to multiple arrests, top executives caught in a web of fraud and deceit. Victoria Lane, the lawyer who had fought tooth and nail for justice, took on new cases, determined to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Lauren Mitchell, the whistleblower who risked everything, became a voice for change, pushing for stricter laws against corporate fraud. And Jack. Jack became a symbol, a living proof that justice, no matter how long it takes, can still prevail. As for Belmont Development Group, they never recovered. The federal investigation expanded. Executives were led away in handcuffs. A massive lawsuit followed, compensating those who had been wronged. Belmont had built an empire on greed, deception, and stolen land. Now, that empire was crumbling. Jack stood in the center of his land, his home watching volunteers hammer, paint, and build. A place that once symbolized loss had become a beacon of hope for Jack and for so many others. Justice had been served. But more than that, a new beginning had risen from the ashes. What do you think about Jack's story? Do you believe justice always wins in the end? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more real-life legal battles that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and keep questioning the truth.